Okay. Now, can you see the Moodle page now?
Yep.
Terrific. Okay, good. Just means that I can flick through this stuff and we'll just talk about it topic by topic. Now, really for the exam, we can really break up the exam into the mathematical questions and the theory questions. And if we look at the course, you'll see that the first few topics, really sort of starting on weeks 2 or 3, down to about topic 7, are all primarily to do with mathematics and DCF. Okay, so weeks 1 and 2, or modules 1 and 2, really just an introduction, so not that much theory in there, just sort of introduces the idea of property as investment. The week 2 one, well, it talks about property investment strategies. When we get down to talking about money and interest, we find that the really interesting strategy that's negative gearing isn't actually covered in module 2 because we're only just setting the foundations. So they're really just introductory modules. When we go to module 3, that's when we're starting to get into the mathematics and especially working with the DCF model. Now, one of the things that you'll see coming in here a lot, and I can't see it on the Moodle page, but all the time suggesting that you check stuff with the financial calculator as you go along. And that's something that I'd kind of recommend. That's what I want to do in the second half of our get together today. Just go through some of this with financial calculator. So we've got basic DCF untaxed in module 3. We've got adding taxation in module 4. Looking at risk and uncertainty in module 5. And here the real core activity is looking at the question of risk and also then adding in graphs and tables. So again, that's kind of primarily skills, although we're starting to look at this whole question of risk and considering risk. Now, risk is a really important issue in the whole financial world. You talk to anybody who's involved in finance in any way, and I'll hardly say anything without talking in some way about risks. Banks especially, and bankers, all they think about is risk. And so developing a bit of a sensitivity to risk is really important to understand anything in finance, and particularly property investment. Ultimately, we've got to ask ourselves, what kind of risks are involved in property investment, and how do they differ from other kind of financial investments and their risks? So is property more risky or less risky than starting your own business or investing in BHP or AMP or something like that? And also, what are the things we have to look out for? Turns out that property does have its own particular risks, and so we're concerned about things like vacancy risk and also our dependency on capital gain and our exposure to the finance markets. And if we borrow too much money and the interest rates go against us, then regardless of whether property is a good investment or a bad investment, bad interest rates or high interest rates coupled with high leverage and low capital gain means that you're going to go broke as a property investor. And that is probably the most important thing. Relatively speaking, and I hope at least some of you have kind of found this when you did the assignment, a lot of the things which people would think of as property risks actually aren't that important. For instance, everyone's afraid, if you've got like a residential investment, you own a home unit or something as a property investment, everyone's afraid that your tenants are going to go and trash the place. You think, well, that's going to be really dreadful because I'm going to have to get builders and, repairmen in to come and, I don't know, replace the carpet or something. relatively speaking, the price of a carpet or the price of fixing a wall or repairing the plumbing or something is a relatively small chunk of the value of the entire asset. And so in the whole scheme of things, especially when you look at the likelihood of that happening, unless you're, I don't know, you're leasing properties out at Brewarrina or some place where you've got all sorts of problems with tenants, maintenance is actually not very expensive. Now, those guys who are involved in property management will probably say, oh, no, but hang on, that really is a bit of a pest because, I've got tenants who are complaining about the taps leaking and whatnot, and it's always kind of costing us money. But to put it into perspective, you find that maintenance is a relatively tiny part of the whole cash flow. The most important things is getting your rents right and also where property's going in the long term. If you're investing in a property which is in a town where everyone's leaving town, then regardless of whatever else happens, the investment's not going to go very well. And so the really important things for property is where the property is, where the property market is going in the longer term. So if you, own a motel and you're in a town where, a freeway bypass or a realignment of the highway, that's an obsolescence issue. Huge problem if you're a property investor. Right? And you don't get that so much in other investments. And so we've got to have our ear to the ground in property, looking at the unique risks. And the main risk is really where the property markets are going in the long term. There are other risks that are there as well, of course, but that's the really important one. So that's kind of risk and uncertainty. As far as modelling risks and uncertainty, we go through those skills, but we've largely assessed those in the assignment. So I'm not going to have very much of that in the exam because it's like a practical DUI sort of skill which suits an assignment rather than an exam test. Okay, so that's module 5. Really, that introduces the significance or the necessity for the next few modules. Let's look at module 6 now. Module 6 is all about debt markets and investment strategies. And I think this is where we do negative gearing. Loan strategist. Can't sit there, maybe not. But module 6 is intended to look more specifically at the finance risks. Now, what I'd like you to come away from this module understanding is that our tendency as a community, as a country, as a culture, has been to borrow more and more money and become more and more dependent on debt over the last little while. And also to look at the way that we've also become dependent on property gain, or capital gain in property. And when if you listen to what Elizabeth Warren's laid out from what she found in the United States, and it seems that the results are pretty similar in Australia from what I've been able to make out, almost everything about living in the United States has got cheaper since about 1970. With the exception of about 3 things that Warren kind of identifies. And the 3 things are real estate prices, health insurance, and childcare. And Warren throws out childcare as not really being that important because in 1970 there tended to be sort of single income households, so childcare just simply wasn't on the map as far as a cost goes. Health insurance she writes off as being something which is inescapable. And in the United States, of course, health insurance is a pretty big issue, so you can't diminish it too much. But the other one is real estate prices. And so what Warren is focusing on is the way that households, like families, are going bankrupt or were going bankrupt at the time when she was writing a book at an alarming rate. There were more households experiencing bankruptcy than there were households experiencing divorce. which is kind of good news if you don't like divorce, but it's kind of scary that, you know, families are being bankrupted all over the place. And it seems that the reason for it is not because not because foods become more expensive or cars have become more expensive or anything else. All those things become cheaper. The main thing that's become more expensive is real estate. Now that's telling us that one way or another, we're living in an era where real estate, because of the high levels of capital gain, is now starting to make a really serious dent in the standards of living of the people that live in it. And while Warren was looking at houses, like dwellings, you can apply the same arguments to businesses. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So in module 6, we're starting to look at this note, or this reality that the households or the tenants have got this kind of juggle going on. How much they spend on real estate, whatever they don't spend on real estate, they end up spending on keeping alive. If it's a business, whatever they don't spend on their rent. If you're running a smash repair shop or I don't know, discount store or something, the more rent you pay, the less wages you're able to pay, the less profit you're able to sort of keep, this sort of thing. And largely that's becoming a major issue in countries like Australia and the United States. And it sort of tells us that we ought to be looking at that more seriously if we're going to understand property investment into the future. Because really the subscript there is that if we're already getting to the point where households are stressed as a result of property investment patterns in the past, then those patterns probably aren't going to be able to survive into the future. Okay? Watching Warren is probably the best thing to do in this module, and just being able to talk about her argument and think about her argument to maybe just the people around you. And this is like a theme that I want you guys to sort of think about as you prepare for the exams. You know, a good way of preparing for the exams is to be able to take an idea from one of the modules. If you can talk to your spouse or your mum or dad or something like that about it, and have a fair kind of an argument, even a general sort of argument, then you'll have enough to get through the exam. Okay? Let's leave module 6 and go on to module 7. Now, module 7 is about, well, I won't say 50-50. There's a bit of skill stuff in it, but it's also about understanding the nature of where the various parameters related to property investment are going into the future. And so the forecasting side, we sort of go through the approaches to forecasting. And also, I wanted you to think about the whole matter of whether the future is going to be like the past. Just about all of our forecasting techniques are all based on taking past data in some form. You know, what's the property market been doing in Rockhampton for the last 5 years? And then saying, well, property has been going through the roof for the last 5 years, therefore it's going to go through the roof, you know, next year, so I'll invest in Rockhampton or Depot Hill or something. Another side to forecasting, though, is recognising that property and also the business world in general goes through cycles. And so while we tend psychologically to use the past to tell us where the future's going, what cycles tell us is that often the future doesn't continue on like the past did. I'm old enough to remember when Johnny Howard was Prime Minister of Australia, way back in 2007, you see, ancient history. And I remember him skiting about how Australia was in such wonderful economic shape. And as a result of that, he wanted to win the election, and Kev 07 sort of came in. And whether Kev was a better bloke than Johnny Howard, I don't know, and I won't say. But the stupidity of thinking that we were going to have an economic boom that was going to go on forever is something that everyone believed back then. But it was what the history was telling us was going to continue on to the future. If you looked at the previous 5 years or the previous 10 years in Australia, from, let's say, 1997 up to 2007, it certainly looked like it was all good news. But if you look at it from a cycles perspective, you can say, well, if it's been going up for a while, that's fairly good indication to suggest that it's probably going to take a turn sometime in the near future. And so with the forecasting module, getting your head around that issue of whether the future is going to be like the past is, I think, very important. And to be able to say that when we look in the past, we don't see, monotonous trends. Everything's going better all the time or everything's going worse. What we find is that some years it goes better, some years it goes worse. And the real trick to success in property investment and business in general is to be able to spot those places where the future is not going to be like the past. So if you can be selling stuff when everyone else is buying, you're going to make a lot of money. If you can be buying stuff when everyone else is selling, likewise, you're going to end up with a lot of bargains. And so forecasting is usually about not being with the mob who read, the domain or, what the gurus are telling you to do in real estate, but really knowing where it's going to go, and especially being on the other side of the counter, if you like, when people are all sort of going in the herd mentality in one direction. So forecasting, getting your head around cycles is really, really important. Now, in there as well, I think we have, do we do chaos? Look. Yeah, okay. No, chapter 7 or module 7 is where we do chaos exercise. The chaos exercise is meant to be a fairly lightweight exercise. It's a relatively simple little spreadsheet. There's only one equation to put in. If you put it in and fill it down, you end up with a most entertaining kind of result, in that it's one of the few places where you can use mathematics to give you kind of a pretty weird sort of result. Normally when we use mathematics, we end up with very regular, predictable kind of results, whereas when you develop chaotic maths systems, you end up with just the opposite. You end up with something that the more you look at it, the less predictable it becomes. And I gave you this little chaos exercise just to sort of dip your toes in the water of the world of chaos. I don't expect everybody to totally understand what chaos has got to offer, but it is important to recognize, to learn that the business world, and the property world in particular, tend to follow the rules of chaos more than the rules of regularity. Because with chaos, you can have a pattern that looks like a cycle, but the next cycle will be different from the last one. And so it'll be hard to spot. With chaos, you never quite know where the turning point is. You do know that they're going to be turning points, but for all sorts of reasons that I won't go into, they've got to do with what in the HSC was the very highest level of mathematics, which I think just about nobody doing business studies kind of studies these days. And so it's a little bit arcane, but sort of simply put, chaos just shows you that the world isn't necessarily as regular as we think it's going to be, which is exactly what we've been finding in the property world for a very long time. Okay, so that's the forecasting module, module 7. We go to module 8. Module 8 is intended to what we call contextualize the whole question of forecasting, where the future's going. And by contextualize, You see, the important thing that you guys are going to learn in your professional lives is the importance of talking to people with experience. You know, come across that in the Val subjects and whatever. But
I have.
Yep. Okay. And I used to find it really kind of frustrating when I first got into the valuation world, because I thought I'd be able to learn all the answers from the books. But the best books tell you to go out and sort of talk to people that are in the ground, you know, on the ground. If you want to find out how to value a motel, you don't go to a book. You go to someone who's been valuing motels for the last 20 years. You know?
They won't agree anyway.
They won't agree. Good on you. Nah. Well, if we want to get a feel for the general history of the property world in Australia, or anywhere else on the planet for that matter, what we really need to do is get a crash course in the history of where property investment's gone in living memory. And preferably to get a bit of a feel for what the forces are that are behind the things that we actually see on the ground. And so in this module, we introduce you to the historical trends in inflation and interest rates. And we make a bit of an argument that those trends were really, really unusual, roughly in the period between 1970 and 1990 in Australia. You know? Now, that's the core thing to learn there. There are a number of explanations for it, but the important thing is that that period, which kind of is more or less the years when a lot of people's parents were taking an interest in the property investment world, you know? Or maybe grandparents these days. And so if you're thinking about investing in property and you go out and ask somebody who's got a lot of experience, say like in your parents' age group, or some, you know, old bloke around the office, what they're going to be doing is telling you what they experienced, which is largely what they saw in the world in this period, 1970 to 2000, roughly. Right? And we'll assume that you guys have sort of come in the last few years and you're getting a bit of experience. But sort of 1970, let's say, to 2010 is sort of ancient history. You ask other people for that. In this module, what we're doing is actually sending the kind of historical perspective back a bit further than that. And what we're saying is that that last generation of experience, let's say 1970 to 2010, is itself a bit peculiar. Right? And that's important because if the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 or 40 years or whatever it is, people have been living in a very strange world, then the next period may not necessarily be living in the same strange world. Right. So there are really two things in this module. One is to look at the historical patterns, especially interest rates and inflation, but also the other things like female labour force participation and all that sort of carry on. But then to put that into the wider perspective and start getting some feel for what are the forces that are kind of operating behind that and what things have resulted from it. Yeah? So module 8 is interesting, especially interesting because it's probably the most important for working out where property investment's going to go into the future. Right? What we would have seen in module 8 is that 1960s, property investor would have been investing in yield. So they'd be borrowing their money for 5 or 6%, let's say 6%. They'd be not expecting a great deal of capital gain, and they'd be borrowing, or they'd be investing because they wanted the rental kind of cash flow stream coming into their pockets. By the time you get to 1980, most property investors were investing on capital gain. They didn't really care too much about yield. So it doesn't matter if the rent was really low, but as long as they were optimistic enough to expect a capital gain, then they were willing to invest in property. And I guess the concern from this module is whether that perspective is something which is robust and going to go into the future. Can we have a world where property continues to increase in value far quicker than everything else in the community, including, the price of food and cars and clothes and whatnot and wages? Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, that's number 8. Number 9 comes away from those high-flying cultural sort of forecasts and stuff, and comes down to the far more common question of strategies and stuff related to borrowing money. And this question of how money works and how interest rate works. Now, this is important for 2 reasons. One is that it's important to understand these different theories of where the interest rate comes from, so you can get a bit of a feel for how to predict where they're going in the future. Now, you probably know yourselves that just about nobody knows where interest rates are going to go in 6 months' time. The night before the RBA sets, basically sort of does things which are going to set interest rates for Australia for the next few months. Really, nobody knows for sure what they're going to do. And yet, when we build a DCF model, we're putting inputs in to suggest that we know where interest rates are going to be in 1, 5, 10 years' time. So, that's a bit of a disconnect. We've got the reality that nobody knows where interest rates are going to be tomorrow, opposed to us doing a DCF model saying we know where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. Right? A hint to understanding how interest rates work is the whole matter of these different theories to explain interest. And once we get into that, they're helpful. And each one of those should be taken fairly seriously, and you should be able to, describe them. Also interesting is the whole question of whether interest rate itself is a good or a bad thing. And that's where we go off and look at things like history and Islamic finance and that sort of stuff. And I know more than a few people are concerned that the Islamic world is now becoming such an important part of the world landscape that if they do their banking completely differently, it's pretty important for our graduates to understand how they do it and whether it's better or worse. So in this module, the important things to go through is the various theories of interest, and also this question of whether interest is a good or a bad thing. And so we do the case study, which is really the Islamic economics, the Islamic finance stuff, which I think is culturally very important in our time. That's module 9. Oh, hang on. Just hang on for a moment. Garrick Small. Oh, I'll have to call you back. Can I just, in about 20 minutes' time? Right. Okay, good, mate. Bye. Where are we? We're going to have to restart our meeting in about 10 minutes. So I'll aim to finish this by the time we finish this part of the tutorial, and then we'll kind of come back and we'll do the mathematics. We're up to money and interest. Module 10. Now, module 10 takes us in a completely different area, but a really important one. Property development is probably the most exciting part of the property industry, and it has a particular character from the point of view of both property finance and also property investment. Most property investment is considered to be long-term, fairly stodgy, fairly low risk, lumpy asset, that sort of thing. Whereas a property developer is looking to make a fairly high level of profit in a fairly risky environment in a very short time frame compared to other property investments. And so property development investment is a very important part of the property investment landscape because they're just so different. Now, in this module, we introduce a simple DCF approach to evaluating property development. And so that's kind of like the skill side. In terms of the theory, the most important thing that we're looking at here is the overall way that property gets its value from the development process, which comes back to the residual land value and the idea of land as a residual. So property development investment, as I say, it's a very different part of the property investment landscape, has its own very unique kind of financing challenges. And so we kind of need to deal with it and sort of basically understand the nuts and bolts of it. But it's really just a matter of kind of just getting a general feel for the general mechanics of property investment rather than, you know, we don't have enough time in one module to go very far into property development.
Mm-hmm.
Go on to chapter 11 or module 11. Module 11 is in some ways the most important theoretical topic in the course because it deals with the very foundations of why we do property investment, and that's property value. You know, where does property value come from? And, you know, why we're investing in property, where a rent's going to go in the future. And it's one thing to say, you know, rent happens as a result of supply and demand or community growth or what have you. But all of those things are true, but it's far more important to understand that they're kind of all expressions of something else. And something else is this rent theory notion, which is what's introduced in chapter 11. So to get on top of this chapter, all that's really necessary is to be able to reproduce the little graph which is in the diagram, you know, the high quality land, low quality land, and the way that the rents tend to cause wages to be equalised right across the market. Okay, and so that's what I'd recommend. And if you really want a top grade, then committing that quote from Adam Smith and reproducing it in an exam question that suits it probably wouldn't be a bad idea. Okay, and to sort of understand that, you know, where rents are coming from. What else can we say? I think that's yeah. As I say, from a theory point of view, you can put together almost everything else if you understand rent theory in property investment. Module 12 is a kind of a necessity. It's one of the topics which is always in a property finance course. It's important if you want to become a fund manager or even an asset manager. A lot of other students probably wouldn't be very interested in it. The core idea in property or portfolio investment, is that if I own one property, I'm exposed to all the risks of that one property. If I spend a quarter of my investment money investing in 4 properties, like a quarter each or something, if one goes down, then the other ones probably won't, so I'll probably have less risk. Now, that's kind of a fairly simple truism. And then it's kind of dolled up into a very elaborate mathematical theory called modern portfolio theory. A big part of this module is devoted to showing why modern portfolio theory doesn't work. Right? And so if you can get to the point where you can sort of see the arguments behind that, and they're really just covered in a couple of slides on the presentation, then that pretty much covers it. Modern portfolio theory you'll find in just about any textbook on finance. Things like the efficient frontier graphs and so on, very, very common. But there are a whole lot of reasons why it appears to work in property, but the time when you really need it to work in property, it tends to fall over and kind of sting you. Okay, so there is a little bit of an irony kind of built into module 12. But again, if you can basically describe modern portfolio theory very, very generally, which is pretty easy. It comes out of the presentation. But then also make some sensible suggestions as to why it may not work very well for property. You'll do really well in any question in the exam that relates to portfolio theory. Okay? And that's pretty much the course done. Okay? Certainly for the theory stuff. Yeah. Okay. What we might do, I might stop Zoom now and I'll come in again and then we might look at some mathematics. Does that sound all right? Let's see if I can get rid of this thing. Oh my goodness. I seem to have some windows that aren't behaving themselves. Main meeting time, 5 minutes. Da-de-da-de-da. Stop video, stop remote control, stop. Just hang on for a moment. Stop share.